Right. I think we're good. All right, so thanks, everyone. So as I mentioned, this is building privacy-safe AI application with Snowflake Cortex, container services, and a privacy gateway. Very explicit title. I thought I was going to win the contest for the longest title, but I think Ivan, who's also speaking right now on the other side, has even longer title than me. But essentially what we're going to talk about is an internal LLM-powered application that I was involved in, a project that I was involved in at Skyflow, and how we were able to leverage some of these technologies to do it in such a way that's private and secure. So in terms of the challenge, is anybody here in a position where they generate content for their company? Maybe it's a blog post, technical writer, writing documentation. Anybody? I think I saw one hand, maybe. But anyway, essentially, if you're in a position where you're generating content, there's essentially a lot of responsibility. So if you're in marketing, or maybe you're in developer relations, or you're a technical writer, or even within product teams, anytime that you're creating essentially new products, new features, you're probably going to have to create content associated with that feature. So that could be technical documentation so people know how to use it. Could be a blog post that also accompanies it. If it's a big enough thing, maybe you have a press release that also talks about that feature or some other part of your company. And then all of these things might have ads or social promotion that are also connected to it. And essentially, this entire content machine never stops. And if you're in those positions, you're generating content and churning it out all the time. So one of the big challenges that we had at Skyflow with my team is, we're a small team. How can we possibly keep up with the demand that our organization has when it comes to all these generating content for all these different surfaces? And then if we go about essentially empowering other people within the company to generate some of this content, how do we do that in a way where we can maintain the quality, consistency, as well as match essentially the tone and the brand that we have for Skyflow? So we want to be able to empower different people within an organization, maybe that's engineering or product, to contribute to this content machine, but do it in such a way that matches our expectations around quality. Now, the other big challenge that we had is essentially the same challenge that many, many companies have, which is this unstructured data challenge, where the answers and references to various questions about our company, the product, or even just internal information lives within these different data silos of these different products. And as companies scale, more and more of these silos generally get created. And there's not a morning that goes by that I don't log into Slack, see a question there that was asked overnight from a team in another time zone, where the answer to that question probably lives in one of these surfaces, but for whatever reason they didn't go look, or maybe they couldn't find it, and it's just easier to ask in Slack. But then you create more problems, essentially, because more and more of the stuff ends up living in a place like Slack, where it's just hard to find it over time. So what we started to think about was, how could we leverage generative AI to help solve some of these problems? So the natural place, I think, to look at something like ChatGPT, and I use ChatGPT all the time, so these limitations aren't necessarily. Did I lose the display? Can you see the screen? Okay, I lost it here. All right. So these limitations aren't necessarily a criticism of ChatGPT, but it's just not designed for this. So some of the problems we run into trying to use it for generating content is the tone's going to be off. It's not necessarily going to speak the same way that we at Skyflow speak. It's missing context. It doesn't have access to our files. So something that's not public information is, of course, not going to have access to. And even if it did have access to our files, I don't know if we'd necessarily be comfortable with it having access to our files as a privacy and security company. And in fact, if you ask ChatGPT what kind of data I shouldn't be sharing with you, it'll actually tell you, do not share personal information, financial information, proprietary information. And if you ask why, it'll also tell you, where it'll say essentially that your personal information could be misused, and I do not have the ability to actually secure, process, or protect personal data. So it's telling you explicitly, do not share this kind of information with me. And this is the same if you try similar queries or prompts within Cohere or any LLM, essentially. So this started getting us to think about, how can we solve this? And that led us to thinking about creating our own content copilot. Because if we create our own content copilot, then it could be customized. It would know about Skyflow. It could have access to our files. It could speak our language. it could generate output that's formatted the way that we expect the format to be outputted. So if you're generating a how-to guide for technical documentation, there's a certain format that we want it to follow, or if you're generating something like a press release, we want it to follow a particular format or template. And then finally, and possibly most critically, this could be private and secure by leveraging technology from companies like Snowflake, as well as some of the work that we're doing at Skyflow around generating or building an LLM privacy gateway. So we could keep the data secure, private, and still serve the needs that we have in terms of creating content and empowering other people within the company. So to do this, a lot of this hinges on doing privacy and security right. And this is a really, really hard problem. Even outside of the world of LLMs, data privacy, data security is a hard problem for companies. And if you just look in Google News on any day of the week, you can find people suffering from data breaches. So it's something that many, many organizations struggle with. But when you bring in LLMs, it gets much more complicated because there's really no rows, no columns, no delete button from an LLM. You're essentially taking a bunch of ingredients, it's like you have carrots and celery and onions, and then you're blending all those down into like a soup broth. And that soup broth is essentially the model. And once you've blended those into a soup broth, it's pretty hard to determine where the carrots and the celery begin and end. And that is sort of the fundamental problem of trying to protect users once things have been entered into an LLM, because you can't tell where a user's information begins and ends. So in the world of GDPR and things like the right to be forgotten, it's pretty hard to satisfy those compliance requirements, basically impossible to do that. And fundamentally, privacy is really about being able to control who sees what, when, and where, and have control over my information. So that when I put in a prompt, like I want to see Cindy Johnson's information, depending on who's putting that prompt in, who has access to the LLM, I should probably get different responses. So if I'm someone from customer support, there should be one expectation in terms of what access I have to Cindy's information. If I'm Cindy, who owns the data, then I should have a different level of access. And if I'm Dave, some random guy, I probably shouldn't be able to see that data at all. The same way that things work in an ideal world when we're working with databases. Now, Skyflow, the company I work for the last year and a half, has been building essentially technology to help solve this problem, where we can detect and de-identify both personal information as well as proprietary information before it hits a model. And essentially replace it with what we call a context-aware token. And we'll get into a little bit of the details for that. But the idea is to create a clean version of the data that then we can do training on or create or vectorize in a RAG model, keeping essentially the sensitive data from ever hitting the model itself. And then the same process we need to apply when it comes to inference. So we put in a prompt. We want to essentially pass that through a privacy gateway to remove any sensitive data, replace it with de-identified forms of data, run our inference against the LLM, and then when we generate a response, if the response has certain de-identified values in it, we want to re-identify that based on policies that are built within the gateway. And this is how we can control who sees what, when, and where, depending on who that person is. And then we can essentially retrieve the data and show it back to the user as expected. And then in the world of Snowflake, they've been working on this platform called Cortex or Cortex AI, which essentially is their platform for doing things with LLMs all the way from the model level, so that could be private, public LLMs, as well as their proprietary model, and then up the stack to sort of consumer-facing products like Snowflake, Copilot, and Document AI. And you can do all the things that we're going to talk about, not necessarily using Snowflake, but we leverage Snowflake in particular for this project just because they have some nice security features as part of the built into the product. All right, so the solution that we came up with was something we call VerbaGPT. And we're going to kind of deep dive into what that is and get into some demos. So for VerbaGPT, we wanted to create this content copilot. And as part of that, we wanted to make sure that it leveraged essentially these privacy-safe LLM features that are built into Skyflow. So we wanted any personal information or internal proprietary information to not necessarily be leaked into the model. And on top of that, we needed fine-grained access control because we don't necessarily want everybody within Skyflow that has access to the VerbaGPT to be able to get the same types of responses. So for example, certain features that we haven't launched yet, we want certain teams within Skyflow to know about it, for example, the technical writing team, so that they can write documentation to go along with it. But we don't necessarily want the sales team to have access to non-public features until they've gone public, because we don't want them to get confused and accidentally sell something that maybe doesn't exist yet. So we need those types of controls built in. So the way that we do that is just like we basically built a RAG model, but that started by building privacy-safe embeddings. So our source material in this case is both a mixture of public and private information. So this is documentation, blogs, PRDs, white papers, other internal information like contracts. And some of this information contains sensitive information. So this is an example of a contract that we signed for to exhibit at the Snowflake Summit, for example. And within this contract, we have things like my name, my phone number, our business registration number. And it's helpful for Verba GPT to know that we're going to exhibit it at the conference so that we could generate maybe a social media post that relates to our presence there. But it doesn't need to know my phone number or our business registration number. So what we can do is essentially take the source material and pass it through Skyflow's LLM privacy gateway to detect where that sensitive data is and replace it with these context-aware tokens. So here I'm replacing the original values, maintaining essentially the property of the entity. So it's a name, it's tagged as a name, or it's tagged as a phone number, or business ID, or whatever it is. But the actual original value is not part of that. And the LLM itself, once you vectorize data, it doesn't really care that it has access to my name. It just needs a representation of my name, like a pointer, essentially. So we can take that, we get clean data, and then our RAG pipeline can continue as normal. So we can essentially go through our sentence splitting and chunking process and generate an embedding model that we store in a vector database. And then in terms of inference, we can provide a similar process where we're passing the prompt to detect and remove any sensitive data, create the embedding of that, search the vectors, get our relevant chunks, and then use a prompt template to essentially attach the chunks as additional context to generate a response. And in this case, we're doing that through Llama 2, which is supported by Cortex. But of course, you could do this with any model, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Cortex framework. And then we pass it back through Skyflow to re-identify those values as necessary to create a contextual response. And then all of that, we essentially package and run within something called Snowpark Container Services, which is a way to essentially run anything that you can put in a Docker container within it's Snowflake's version of essentially managed Kubernetes. And we're going to take a look at, when I get into the demo, of how you actually deploy something Snowpark Container Service. So we create sort of this walled garden around the LLM that we're running within our own Snowflake account. Now, it's one thing to build this RAG model, make all that stuff available, and expose it as an API, but it's not necessarily super useful. The people on the marketing team and other teams within Skyflow are not going to be able to call the API to get something. So we built a front end in Streamlit to support both the chat and draft interface to Verba GPT. So it's basically just a web application that we run within Snowpark Container Services. And you can chat with it like you would ChatGPT. But the other feature that we primarily use for generating content is a draft mode where we can select the kind of template or that we want to generate, like a how-to guide or a press release or something. And we can even upload files as part of that experience, so you can add additional context if necessary, if it's not part of the original training corpus. And the last thing I'll get into before we start to dive into the demo is this idea of contextual composition, which is something we created. So within certain use cases, like generating content in this case, we care a lot more about the accuracy of the result and the quality of the result than necessarily the speed with which we get it back. So if it takes 45 seconds or a minute to generate a response, but the accuracy is way better than generating something that comes back in 2 seconds, we'll take it's much better to essentially optimize for the accuracy. Because what we want is to get something as close to first draft as possible. So the speed is less of a factor here. And taking that into account, what we can do is when we're generating essentially our responses, is we run this RAG process multiple times. Because part of it, too, is if you're generating a long-form document, say like a blog post, then you have generally, if you just go to, say, ChatGPT and you say, write a blog post about, I don't know, Node.js integration with Stripe or something, it's going to generate something, but it's going to be very general. But if you, instead, break it down into smaller tasks, like write an introduction that talks about these specific things, and then write a follow-up paragraph and a follow-up paragraph, you'll get a better result. So because LLMs, even though they're general, do much, much better when you give them sort of predefined tasks like that. And that's what we're doing here, where we're performing this inference cycle. We're creating a working draft based on the template with which we want to create these documents, and then we continually create that working draft, evaluating the context each time until we get a full response, essentially. So we could run the inference cycle multiple times until we get something that we're actually predict through our evaluation model is of the meets the quality bar that we want. And this allows us to generate longer form content that is essentially outperforms just a sort of general model. All right, so let's get into the demo here. So we're going to take a look at, to start, whoa, this is small. Let's blow this up a little bit. Let's just take a look first here at ChatGPT. So as a comparison. So I said, write a press release announcing Skyflow's Snowflake native app. And it comes back with something. And it's not that bad, but there's definitely things in here that are using language that we would never, ever use within Skyflow, like unparalleled level, for example. That sounds very sort of marketing heavy. And as you would expect, the response is not bad, but it's pretty general because it doesn't have that much information. And then if we compare that to, say, VerbaGPT, so I did the same thing here, and I selected as a draft template press release. And so here I get something that's formatted a lot closer to what we would consider as a first draft. And so it says, today Skyflow, the data privacy vault company, unveiled a Snowflake native app, a powerful new integration that allows Snowflake customers to seamlessly discover, tokenize, query-sensitive data, blah, blah, blah. So it goes into a lot more detail about how it actually integrates. It breaks down specific use cases, fintech, healthcare, retail, which are three of the big verticals we play in, because it has a lot more information about who we are as a company. And the language it uses is a lot more direct and concise, which is the style with which we would expect to write something. All right, so let's go next, take a look at, actually, we'll do one more thing here. So we'll do, say I want to generate a how-to guide. So I'll say, write a how-to guide that integrates Skyflow with, can't type, with Snowflake. So that'll churn for a little bit. And then we'll do the same thing over here. That was my internet connection. There we go. All right, so it's going to generate this response. Let's see if VerbaGPT came back yet. There we go. So, all right. So if we compare these again, if you go through this, if you didn't know anything about how Skyflow functions or Snowflake, it looks like plausible, but the source code that it generates is completely made up. Like, this is not a real thing, for example. So if I was a technical writer on the team, it would actually take me probably more time to undo the damage of this and fix it than just writing something from scratch. Whereas here in VerbaGPT, first of all, the format of this is much more aligned with how we would write a how-to guide, because we're telling it explicitly how the sections to write. Based on the template that we created, and then it goes through, generates actual code that matches how the app actually works. So this is a lot, and then it can interlink existing documentation. So again, it's like a lot more close to sort of first draft than what we could get from something like ChatGPT. All right, so last thing we'll take a look at, let me just blow this up a little bit, is how do we run this within Snowpark Container Services? So again, Snowpark Container Services is Snowflake's service for running sort of managed Kubernetes. So last year, they announced this feature. Essentially, you can take anything you put in a Docker container, you can run within this managed Kubernetes environment within your Snowflake account. And it'll run securely within your Snowflake account. And you can control essentially ingress and egress. So here, the first thing I'm doing is setting up OAuth so that you have to log in essentially through Snowflake in order to access VerbaGPT. Any Snowpark container runs within a compute pool. So here I'm creating a compute pool. You're in control of min nodes, max nodes, how big essentially the GPU or CPU family is. Here I'm running it on extra small, but you can create GPUs as well. And then because Snowflake essentially assumes, it puts security first in this case, it doesn't allow you to just call out to any APIs without you explicitly saying, I want to call this API. So here I'm creating some rules that allow me to call out to specific APIs. Then I create a warehouse. This is all kind of standard stuff that you do in Snowflake. The next thing of note here is, essentially, you need to take your Docker container and put it somewhere that Snowflake can access. And this is what an image repository within Snowflake is. So you can essentially create your Docker container locally on your computer, and then you can push it into an image repository. So I've already done that, taking essentially VerbaGBT and pushing it into this image repository. And then once you have a compute pool in an image repository, you can tie those things together by creating either services or jobs. So a job is kind of like a cron job where you run on a certain time base. Whereas a service is a long-running service like a web application. So here we're creating a service for VerbaGBT. We're tying it to our compute pool, and then we're pointing it to that image, the container within the image repository. And I can't run this live because it takes several minutes to set up. But if you look at, we run the service endpoint query here, we can see here that it's running on port 8501, and it spits out this URL. So if we copy now this URL and put it in the browser, it should force me to log in. And then it's going to have 2FA enabled for security purposes. So once I do that, then essentially we should be good and VerbaGBT loads. So now this is all running. It might be hard to see with the screen so small, but essentially this is running all within that Snowpark container. So this is running directly within my Snowflake account. And no one outside of Skyflow can essentially have access. All right, so let's go back here and just kind of start to wrap up. So that's a quick demo into some of the features and functionalities, how we're sort of running that within a secure environment, and also making sure that we're not accidentally leaking proprietary information. But on top of that, I wanted to go through a few results here. So the big thing that we're getting, or the value we get from VerbaGBT, is this idea of getting closer to first draft much, much faster. And we've been able to take that time down from a couple weeks for down to like 10 minutes, essentially. So now, like, our product team can help create content for documentation. So they can create essentially the first draft. It'll still be edited by a technical writer, and they'll do the final round. But essentially, the product team is able to contribute in a much more meaningful way to creating content for the docs, as well as things like RCAs for the engineering team, or even blog posts written by engineers. Sometimes they want to contribute to content, but they might not be comfortable writing long-form content, and this gets them a lot closer to be able to take some ideas that they have and actually generate something useful and meaningful that the marketing team can pick up and sort of massage into a full blog post. And then we were able to do all this holding to our principles as a privacy and security company of balancing privacy and security through using this concept of a privacy gateway to keep sensitive data from leaking the model, while also using the security features of Snowflake to create sort of this walled garden where no one can sort of get access to the model outside of a Skyflow employee. All right, well, I want to thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about that, you can check out skyflow.com and some of the stuff that we're doing there. But thank you, and have a great rest of the event.